All right, so you've finished the first draft of your outline with all the big picture points, and now you're ready to add detail. That's what we're going to cover in this video. Hey, I'm Megan. I'm a professional writer, published author, and writing coach, and I help frustrated writers organize their writing process so they can finish their projects and meet their goals. Today I'm continuing on in a series I've been doing on outlining. I'm a big believer in doing multiple drafts of an outline, so if you haven't seen my videos on how to start an outline and finish your first draft, those videos are what I'm going to build on today. Otherwise, all you'll need to work through this with me today is the first draft of your outline with all of its big picture, high-level points. I'm going to use my own outline to show you how I think through adding detail in the hopes that it'll help you do the same with yours. And today we're just going to be focusing on adding detail to the first part of our story, what happens before the turning point. So let's start. Okay, first things first, make sure you're still on board with your premise. This is what your character is going to learn by the end of your story. For a refresher, here's mine. Vulnerability opens the door for more meaningful relationships and deeper healing. That's what I want my main character to learn by the end of the story. If you don't have a premise for your story, I really encourage you to try and find one. If you're not sure how to do that, I've made a video you can watch on that as well. Alright, so here's what the first draft of the first half of my outline looks like so far. Let's zoom in on the first few points so I can show you how I add detail. My first point is MC, that's my main character, is in the city working, life is normal. My second point is MC gets news that forces her to face something vulnerable. So we're just going to work within these 2 points for this video. So the first question you can ask yourself when you're trying to add detail is, what's the goal of each of my plot points? Or what's the point of this point? So I know that the point or the goal of the first point is to show the reader who my main character is before the story kicks off, before she starts to move toward the premise. In other words, I have to show her at the other end of the spectrum, where she is when she starts, which is fully against the premise. Now I know the goal of the second point is to act as the catalyst for my story, the point at which my main character's life changes. So from there, you're going to ask yourself questions like, what needs to happen to make that happen? I know I can't show my main character's whole life in one scene or one chapter, so I'll have to break down that one point into multiple points. So let's do that. Here are some questions I might ask myself. What's her life like? Who is she? What kinds of situations would highlight her opinion on the premise? Those are some of the questions I would ask. What are some of the questions you would ask about your first point? I encourage you to write some of them down. Always be thinking, what is the point of this plot point? What does this part of the story need to accomplish? What scenes, what actions would help it do that? You may find that you have to go back and think about your characters in more depth. Or if you've watched my video on character development, then you've already got your homework done and you can just refer to your notes and answer those questions more easily. Okay, so from there, I'll attempt to answer some of these questions. Again, this is draft 2 of my outline, so it's still going to be pretty high level, but we're going to get a little bit more specific. So looking at that first plot point, what does it mean that my main character's life is normal? So I'm going to start with that first question. What is her life like? Okay, well, where does she live? What are her main relationships? And where does she work? Going from there, I'll know what kind of scenes I need. So I'm going to break that down further into, I know I'll need to show her at home, show her interacting with her friends or her boyfriend or her boss or anyone who's in her life, and I'll need to show her at work. So that's where I'm going to leave that for now. See, it's still pretty high level, but it gives me a launching pad to add further detail once I've gone through each point in this current draft. So you might be like me and sometimes you get so into adding all the details into one plot point, it can be really overwhelming. Like what I like about keeping it big picture throughout each draft and adding just a little bit more detail to each point as you go is that you keep a big picture view of your story. You're not adding a whole clump of details over here and like no details over there. And then details you added over here are going to impact what happens over there, but then you might add more detail here and then that throws off that. We're keeping it as even as we can throughout each draft. Okay, now back to that point. With the other 2 questions, who is she and what shows her opinion of the premise, those will likely be answered as I write the scenes for the first question, what is her life like? But it can still be helpful for you to think through them, especially the third one. So let's do that really quick. What might help us show how our main character feels about our premise? We could show it through how she approaches work, how she approaches her relationship, how she interacts with others. We could show it through her opinions, thoughts, actions, even her gestures and expressions. Remember, the whole point of these opening scenes is to give the reader a sense of where the character is at in terms of the premise. You want to start in a place where the reader is going to be able to see where your character grows throughout the story. So everything from the way they interact with a waitress, to how they talk to their boss, to what they do in their free time is going to give the reader a glimpse into what they think about things like vulnerability, in my case. In your case, it'll be something else. Okay, so let's zoom out and see where we're at with this first point. I'm going to try to fit all the bubbles in there. There it is. If all these bubbles have you feeling a little overwhelmed, I just encourage you to make a simple graphic for yourself. Don't try to overcomplicate. I know a lot of people use like sticky notes all over their walls and color-coded charts. If that works for you, awesome. It kind of overwhelms me, so I'm much more likely to just keep it simple, write a bullet point list. I use these graphics here because they're fun for me to make and they actually help me think about how everything fits together, but you're gonna have to find your own system. If you're not sure what to do, just start by writing it down on a piece of paper. Bullet points, really simple. All right, let me run through the questions I would ask for one more point and then I'll wrap up. So now we're going to run through the second point in our outline. Start by asking the same question you asked for the first point. What's the point or goal of this plot point? For me, the goal for this plot point, as I said before, is to act as a catalyst that will change my MC's life. Everything we just set up in the previous scenes, showing where she works, her relationships, and hinting at her opinion of the premise, is now going to be kind of turned upside down by something. But what's that going to be? So again, I ask myself, what needs to happen to make that happen? What needs to happen in order to turn her life upside down and force her to face something vulnerable? So I might ask myself questions like, what kind of news would actually disrupt her life the most? Knowing who she is and her life and her background, what kind of news is going to throw her for a loop? What's vulnerable for her? What kind of news would invite her to face something vulnerable? Situations that are vulnerable for my main character aren't going to be vulnerable for your main character. So this is where you really need to know who your characters are so that you know what kind of pushes those points for them. And then what kind of scenario would force her to step into it? In other words, not ignore it. It has to be something she can't say no to, which is what she'd do normally, and hopefully something we've seen her do in the preceding scenes. So the whole point of the catalyst is there's no turning back after that, so she can't have an out. Since I already know what the catalyst is going to be, I can add those details in now. So these first two questions are essentially answered by the same thing, having to go back home and see her father. She's going to get news that her father is sick. She's got to go take care of him. That's going to be the catalyst moment. It's not that she knows this is a vulnerable situation for her to be in. It's just that it is, and she doesn't want to do it. And we know, well, I know as the author, that she doesn't want to do it because it's vulnerable for her. So remember, because she's in a place right now where she disagrees with my premise that vulnerability opens you up to more meaningful relationships and deeper healing, she's going to fight this catalyst as much as she can. But because it's the point of no return, something has to happen that makes her go. So for the question at the bottom, I think the only way she'd actually go is if someone she respected made it clear that they wanted her to, and that she would have really no reasonable excuse not to go. Since she only really respects her boss, and she's so driven to perform well at work, I think her boss is going to somehow convince her. Unlike my main character, her boss agrees more with the premise. So she's going to have a higher value for my main character going home and taking care of her father, and encourage my main character to do that. And then maybe something that would have kept her from going falls through, I don't know, but she's going to have no excuse not to go. Okay, let's stop there for now. So you've probably noticed that these points are still high level. I started with things like main characters living in the city, working, life is normal, and I've really only gone to things like show her at work, show her at home, show her with her friends. But again, this is my second draft, so once I do this for all of my points, I can go back through and say, okay, how am I going to show her at home? How am I going to show her at work? How am I going to show her with her friends? What scenes will come to mind for me then? And you add more detail. So now that we've walked through a little bit about how I think through adding detail, I want to give you a couple extra tips and pieces of encouragement as you go forward. Some points of your outline are going to be harder to flesh out than others. For instance, even before I started outlining, when I got the idea for this story, I knew what the catalyst was going to be. I knew some of the key scenes I wanted to include, but not necessarily exactly where they were going to show up in my story. So for those plot points, I can add detail really quickly. For others, and for me it's usually the ones in the middle, I'm going to be like, I don't know. But that's why I like starting with the big picture so that I can see what's going to happen in my story and how it's all going to fit together piece by piece through multiple drafts. If some points are harder than others, don't get discouraged. Even James Patterson, and he's the one that I got this idea for multiple outline drafts from anyway, even he says that sometimes certain points in his outline are unclear all the way up to like the last draft. And he typically does 6 or 7 drafts. So don't be discouraged. It'll come to you. If you get stuck as you go along, try asking yourself more questions. What needs to happen at this point? What could happen? Don't limit yourself or your imagination. Even if something silly or unrealistic comes up and you're like, that would make no sense in my story, just try to brainstorm ideas. You never know what's going to come from that. You might need to think through a few options of what could happen before you land on the one that's right for your story. If you want more videos on how to think through each part of the writing process and keep your projects organized, and why wouldn't you, hit that subscribe button. I hope you have a great day and happy writing.